asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
My next guest is a terrific guy. Check out Truth Jihad. He's a broadcaster, academic, author. And I don't need to tell you, because I've told you 1,000 times. I came across him many years ago when he took on Fox News, when he was being challenged because he was asking his students to consider all the information that was coming out about September the 11th. Brilliant academic, multilingual, could say a lot more about him, but we want to have more time with him. So let's welcome back to the programme Dr. Kevin Barrett. Kev, welcome back. How are you?
Hey, thank you, Richie. It's always good to be with you. I love talking with you.
Thanks, mate. Love talking to you too. And of course, I saw you yesterday when the Supreme Court upheld this ban on people travelling from these countries where predominantly people are Muslims. You and I are old friends. You know what I think about these things, Kevin. We know why these countries were destabilised. They were destabilised by the neocon Zionist puppet masters that control Trump now. My big fear is, Kevin, that the independent media has become worthless. Apart from maybe a handful of bloggers, writers such as yourself and others, we've gotten into this identity politics, black and white, left versus right now, that people who used to talk about why Syria is destroyed, why Libya has been destroyed, now those people have gone to, I'm not going to say that, well, I am going to say the dark side, and they've gone to the whole, well, you know, I support Donald Trump, I'm on the alt-right, we've got to keep out those goddamn Muslims. What's going on, Kevin?
It is pretty sad, isn't it, Richie? You know, some of my old comrades in the 9/11 truth movement who used to react when I would say, yeah, this is obviously done to incite Islamophobia and launch a war against Muslim countries, and we know certain parties will benefit from that. They'd say, yeah, right, it's all about Islamophobia. So, you know, obviously, if we're exposing 9/11 truth, we're removing the reason for the Islamophobia. We're going to have peace. We'll get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. That's the sort of thing I was hearing from Alex Jones and all sorts of others who today have swallowed that Trump Kool-Aid, and suddenly they've got this weird sort of schizoid relationship between recognizing 9/11 being a false flag designed to create Islamophobia, and then having their own minds and emotions victimized by the very Islamophobia that was created by 9/11. So that's a real mind trap. These people have tied themselves up in knots, and they need to cut those ropes and break free and learn how to think freely again.
And you know what's happening, I think a lot of it is to do with money and status, and I'll tell you why. Now, I've never been a victim, and I've never, ever claimed that I've been targeted by anybody. I'm not that stupid, I'm not that narcissistic. But what I have been doing in recent months, I'm lucky enough to know some people that are very smart when it comes to the internet, and we're talking things like algorithms and, you know, all the stuff that I wouldn't know anything about. What's happening is so-called independent media, content creators, the ones who have moved away from trying to understand what is really happening and why, and who have now gone into the alt-right versus far-left game, they're being promoted, Kevin. They are being promoted on steroids in terms of their reach is being promoted. Now, I saw this back in January. Now, again, I'm not important. My show, the platform is important, and the people who come on my show are important, but I'm not. But I noticed that back in January, my YouTube channel was 3 years old then, and it had reached about 80,000 subscribers. And the YouTube channel of Tommy Robinson, who's, you could call him a far-right agitator turned pretend journalist, his YouTube channel was about as old as mine at the time, or maybe a little bit younger. And he had nearly the same amount of subscribers as me, but nowhere near as many views. What happened was I was having videos taken off, basically deleted for no reason, and I was getting warnings. And my reach was going down, even though my subscriber numbers were going up. And all of a sudden, this guy and others, their subscriber numbers went through the roof. And I talked about this with other content creators as well, who don't take the alt-right or alt-left point of view, but who see things in non-black and white kind of frame of references. And they were seeing the same thing. A lot of them are going down this road, Kevin, because there's money in it and there's status in it. And doing what real journalists should do, which is to just walk past this identity politics nonsense and this right versus left nonsense. Those people who are doing that, their reach is being affected. They are being marginalised, and you can't find their articles when you go on to Google or other search engines. So I think it's even more sinister than Alex Jones and people like that have just lost the plot. I think it's even worse than that. They haven't lost the plot, Kev. They've gone where the money is.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not only that there's more money just naturally to be made by pandering to people's worst instincts, but I think you're right in sort of suggesting that somebody's tweaking YouTube, somebody's tweaking Google to help people like Tommy Robinson and to put a lid on people like you, because Tommy Robinson is helping discredit all forms of alternative thought among the thinking people who are still, dominating the world of movers and shakers, the folks who really sort of decide things in the world, and the people in the universities, the people who are lawyers dealing with some form of public policy, all of those folks, they see Tommy Robinson is the alt guy. He's the person representing the way people think in the sort of populist alternative media, and they run screaming away and are willing to crack down on all forms of alternative inquiry. And it's ironic that what they seem to be doing is actually promoting the haters and trying to hide the non-haters. And that's totally against the rationale, the official rationale of what they're doing. Whenever they ban people and give people strikes and do everything, to secretly turn down the dial to try to keep you from being seen, they're supposed to be only doing that if there's some kind of genuine sort of hate speech issue involved or a legal issue or whatever. But in fact, they're going after people like you who don't have a hating bone in your body, and then pumping up the views for people like Tommy Robinson, who are putting out a message of total hate and are funded by the usual suspects over in Tel Aviv. So, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see that there's a concerted effort out there to try to stop the really sensible part of the alternative media and to promote the worst part of it. And I think that they gain in doing that in many ways.
Yeah, because if you're talking to people, because people like you particularly and others, and I've always tried to be like it, I understand why people in cities around this country, why they feel the way they do about immigration and about migration and about what's happened in the Middle East and what it's led to, and not just now but historically. And I always say to them, look, of course, migration and enforced migration has consequences for people, for their livelihoods. It has consequences for public services. There's no doubt about that. But I'm happy to engage with those people and say, look, I certainly don't know everything, but you've got to consider, who does that ultimately benefit? And why did 3 million people leave Iraq? Why did they leave Iraq? Why have a couple of million people or more fled Syria? Why have they fled Libya? Why have they fled North Africa? And they come into Europe and Southern Europe, and there are consequences, social consequences because of that. And of course, people go crazy. And of course, this is what the establishment wants, Kevin. But in order to learn and to grow and to understand what's going on, you have to kind of try to understand the average man and woman who don't get their information from anywhere else but the BBC. You have to try and understand where they're coming from as well. And when you have that philosophy, well, then I suppose the system doesn't want to have anything to do with you, because that's a moderate philosophy, understanding that not everything is black and white. There are shades of grey. We have to work around that and work through it to get to the ultimate truth. But I've asked you this before, and I don't want to get bogged down in this because there's loads we can talk about. What do you do, Kevin? Because when you are dealing with people, and it's not just migrants from Syria and Iraq, it's migrants from Eastern Europe as well. Tony Blair was talking today on the BBC where he was challenged about the open door immigration policy he had and how 2.5 million economic migrants came into the country soon after he came to power, and the effect that that had on driving down wages, working conditions, and how it affected public services. So those people have a genuine grievance. Even they're wrong to blame Muslims for it, they're wrong to blame anybody else for it, but they have a genuine grievance. How do you work with that?
Well, I think you have to just keep doing what you're doing, Richie, which is to talk about it reasonably and honestly. And that is a real threat to the powers that be, because if we get a hearing from relatively smart, sensible people, and to some extent, smart people who are capable of working with others do tend to sort of gravitate into a lot of the powerful, influential positions, although psychopaths gravitate into some of them too. But if we are putting out an argument that's well backed up and that's open to hearing the viewpoints of people who have legitimate grievances, let's say about immigration, we're actually more dangerous because we're more likely to actually influence people who make decisions. As far as, how do we talk to ordinary people about this? I do think we have to keep emphasizing what Lee Camp recently said in an article. I think he published it at Russia Today, that Trump is dropping a bomb every 12 seconds. That's one of the main reasons why people are leaving places like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and so many other places. And it's been all these bombs that have been dropping on these countries for so many years, especially the predominantly Muslim countries that the Islamophobes are so worried about, that are driving people out of those countries and creating this crisis in the first place. So radically reforming the foreign policy by stopping these bombs that are dropping every 12 seconds, in which 98% of the people being killed are not the targets. This is the drone strikes. They're only killing 2% of the people killed are the targets. The other 98% are collateral damage. And this is messing up these societies. It's making these places unlivable. It's making people really hate us. There may really be a terrorism problem someday. There isn't so far. So far, you're far more likely to be killed by lightning or, drown in your bathtub than to be killed by terrorists in any of the Western countries, at least. But if we keep, pissing off millions and millions and millions of people and creating these tides of refugees, one of those people might turn out to be a brilliant biochemist or a germ warfare scientist who whips something up in his basement and gets some serious revenge. So we're really playing with fire. These are terrible policies. We need to talk to folks and say, you're right. We don't want this kind of immigration that we're seeing, and we need to stop it sanely and sensibly. And the first place to stop it is by stopping these wars.
I had an email last year from a relative of somebody who was hurt at the Manchester Arena last year. Now, this is the first I've mentioned this. I didn't mention it on the programme before. It was somebody who emailed me and said that his cousin was badly injured and had to have surgery. And he was annoyed with me, and he said, it was a very polite email, but also very, very firm. And he said to me, guys like you, the bleeding hearts, you're always saying that, it's not the Muslims, it's not the Muslims. But he said it was, in this instance. Try tell that to the people who died. And we had an exchange of about 4 or 5 emails. And I said, well, just let's pretend that we know for a fact that Salman Abedi did it. And we don't know for a fact that he did it, funnily enough. But let's pretend that he did do it. What about what's going on in Libya, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who's responsible for that? Do you not take that into consideration? And the kind of heartfelt reply that came back was, when you're underneath it, and you're dealing with it, you actually don't care. It was kind of almost callous, but almost understandable as well. When you're affected by it, and someone belonging to you is hurt, you don't care. It doesn't matter. Leave that to the politicians. The fact is, we had a Muslim terrorist in the city and all of that. And I just said to the guy, look, we don't know for a fact that he did it. And I wanted to mention that just because of what you said there about there not being, a serious terrorist problem today. You're right to say that. There was a serious problem in the 1970s and 1980s when Irish Republicans were doing sometimes some pretty unspeakable things in this country.
British agents posing as Irish Republicans in some cases.
In some cases, absolutely. But in some cases, it was IRA actors over here blowing up pubs and blowing up Remembrance Day parades and stuff like that. Listen, I'm an Irish Republican, Kevin. But I have no truck with violence, and I have no truck with, the I suppose, the latter day IRA. But we could be here all night talking about that. But anyway, that's when there was a terrorist threat. And even then, you were more likely to be killed by a falling piano. And people didn't want to change society the way they want to change society today because of it. But you're right. Some of these events that have happened in recent times have more questions than answers. Tony Gosling was on this programme only the other day talking about information that keeps coming to light about the crazy story around the Manchester bombing, where I am convinced people did die and people were hurt, because I know a nurse who treated some of these people at a hospital nearby. But let me just remind our listeners, Kevin Barrett is live on the line. Check out truthjihad.com. Kevin's a broadcaster, academic, author, for many years challenging the official narrative when it comes to geopolitical affairs, terrorism. Kevin is a Muslim convert as well. Don't have to mention that, but I mention it tonight because we're talking about the Trump travel ban. How distressing is it for you that we have moved into this post-fact world? You mentioned there the comedian and broadcaster Lee Camp, who quite rightly said that bombing countries hasn't stopped under Mr. Non-Interventionist Donald Trump. It's carried on at a rate of knots. But you couldn't say that to somebody who identifies as a Trump supporter, because, Kevin, facts don't matter anymore, do they?
That's right. People really need to work hard to kind of get outside of their own skin and see things from a broader perspective. It's the guy you were exchanging emails with who said, doesn't matter, nothing matters except my pain because I lost somebody in this bombing, so I'm going to hate Muslims. Well, that person, he needs to get outside of his skin and recognize that, according to Dr. Gidjan Palya, the Australian researcher, 30 million Muslims have been killed since 9/11 in these wars launched by 9/11. So that's 30 million people killed, maybe 100 million plus had their lives ruined. And these people have survivors and family members who have, they've lost people. They've had people close to them whose lives have been ruined. And each of those people, of those 100 million plus people, feels the same way you do. You lost your friend in Manchester. Each one of those 100 million plus people lost somebody or knew somebody whose life was ruined, who had their lives ruined. And those people feel the same way you do, but there's like 100 plus million of them. And, so maybe it's time to rise above our own little tribal affiliation and, I only care about myself and the people who look like me. And recognize that other people are in the same kind of situations that we are, and sometimes much worse situations. And in this case, even if this Manchester thing really was some angry Muslim, well, he has a darn good reason to be angry. Remember, 30 million Muslims killed. How can you just, how can you have an Islamophobic response to this kind of thing when most of these are false flags? The big celebrated ones like 7/7, the anniversary is coming up, totally proven, obvious false flag, proven 7 ways from Sunday. Yeah. And it's still, people are drooling and salivating with this Pavlov's dog Islamophobia. And it's getting worse all the time. So I don't know. It is a post-fact world, I guess, but all we can do is try to preserve a small corner of factual discourse on the internet radio airwaves, I guess. Yeah,
that being said, now the guy I was speaking with whose cousin was injured, he certainly didn't hate Muslims. His mantra was that, right, whatever, he said, there was no hatred. He was basically saying the government has to do something about it. The government have to do something about it, meaning that they've got to stop immigration. They've got to stop migration immediately. Close down the country, close down the borders. And I can understand why somebody would come to that conclusion. And I hear you when you say, yeah, you've got millions of Muslims whose lives have been destroyed, and I'll never know what that's like. I know you've travelled in some of these places, Kevin. I never have done. I saw a video clip some years ago of an Iraqi lady. I think you'll remember the clip. I think Michael Moore might have used it in Fahrenheit 9/11, when a baby has been wrapped up into a bundle of rags and has been thrown onto the back of a lorry. And I was in the cinema watching this years ago, and I'll never forget the screams of the woman. It haunted me for weeks afterwards. I'd never experienced anything like it going to the cinema. I thought we'd see a kind of a satirical kind of lampooning of the idiot Bush, which we did, but there was some very... Now, I'm no fan of Michael Moore, but, I know a lot more about more now than I did then. But it was unbelievable. And I was able to wonder, Jesus, what if that was me? How would I deal with that? That some thousands of miles away, some country sends its military and all its hardware and pounds my country into the ground, into the Stone Age. But our friend, the person we've mentioned, whose cousin was injured at the arena bombing, these people get all their information from national media sources. That's all they know, and it's not their fault that they only get their information from there. We can't expect them, therefore, to say, yeah, it happened to me today, but it happens to Muslims every other day of the week. It just doesn't work like that, Kev.
Well, that's right. I guess we have to try to encourage people to tune in to the part of the media that does tell the truth and present things in an accurate and balanced way. Of course, that is a kind of a small corner of the media. Here in the U.S., it's a little different in that we have similar situations with Trump accentuating the cases where some immigrant, usually a Hispanic immigrant, sometimes a Muslim immigrant, but more often Hispanic, has done some horrible thing. And that does emotionally galvanize people, but they're not stepping back and seeing that if you look at the big picture, the illegal immigrants are actually committing fewer crimes than the native born. And so theoretically, if you were going to be rational, you might say, well, if we want to lower our crime rate so fewer people have to suffer these horrible kinds of occurrences, we should deport all the native-born people and have nothing but illegal immigrants here. We would have fewer crimes per capita. If we could replace 300 million current Americans with 300 million illegal immigrants, statistics tell us that we would have a lot fewer of these terrible cases. And of course, I'm being facetious in suggesting that.
Yeah.
But again, the facts and logic don't always go hand in hand with the way people react emotionally to cherry-picked information.
What's the reaction to what happened with the Supreme Court? And you've obviously read more about it than I have. I know you've written a very funny and witty piece about it, which I know you sent to me, so I've got it there. I'll put a link out to it on Twitter. The reaction, I suppose, is the reaction that they wanted. There's on the right side of the sphere, there's jubilation and screaming and triumphalism, and the Bernie Sanders and the Hillary supporters are doing what they do. This is identity politics 101. They're screaming that this is anti-American, it's inhumane and all of this. They get exactly what they want, don't they? Divide, divide, divide.
Yeah, it's very effective. I think all of this identity politics hysteria has been concocted to try to put a lid on the kind of social activism that was threatening to bring more peace and justice to the world. Back in the 60s and after the 60s, there was a big movement for justice against the Vietnam War and civil rights and all of that. And then it suddenly got twisted. We had the women's movement, which is not in itself entirely a bad thing, and the gay rights movement, which is maybe not entirely a bad thing either. And then, we had all sorts of accentuations of black identity as opposed to demanding an end to poverty. If you want to really help the black people who are suffering from discrimination here in the United States, you would end poverty. That would be the main issue. You wouldn't be trying to give more black middle class people college scholarships and things like that. You wouldn't be having black people get into their African roots and so on and so forth. No, you'd be making sure we brought back factories and changed the economy in such a way as to support working people, because those are the people who are hurt. The factories moved overseas, and these African American poor neighborhoods got much worse. But identity politics came and blew smoke over the whole thing and confused everybody. We saw it in the campuses where genuinely, quote unquote, radical people, meaning people who are trying to find ways to change society at its root to make things better, got sort of twisted or forced out. And then we got all of these raving identity politics people trying to convince the students, the younger generations, that the way to be radical is to, scream and yell about, women's rights and gay rights and black rights and Chicano rights and whatever. And that just totally derailed that movement for social change, which would have threatened the privileges of the powerful and privileged. I think the powerful and privileged were behind that in the same way they were behind defunding a lot of American liberal education. The reason we had those protests in the 60s here against Vietnam, Richie, and civil rights as well to some extent, was that post-World War II, the government put a ton of money into liberal education at the public universities. Anybody could get a really good liberal education at a public university, like here in Madison, Wisconsin. So all kinds of smart young kids got into college and were thinking these dangerous, subversive thoughts and using critical thinking skills. And that couldn't continue. So they slashed the funding for those programs, made college vastly more expensive, created more of a dog-eat-dog world, and then hyped identity politics. And the result is this Orwellian dystopia that we're living in now.
Yeah, absolutely right. Kevin Barrett is our guest, Madison, Wisconsin professor, PhD, polyglot's probably the word for Kevin, really. Polyglot, there's a word. Next time you're playing Scrabble, remember Uncle Richie told you polyglot. It means speaking several languages fluently. Converted to Islam some years ago. Kevin was first introduced. Well, I was first introduced to Kevin when he was on Fox News many years ago, challenging the official narrative around 9/11 when he was being castigated by the US media because he dared to suggest to his students that they actually think for themselves. Heaven forbid. These people, Kevin, we're talking about, they were behind, I suppose, this idea of multiculturalism. And again, I'm not trying to be all things to all people. I know I sometimes might sound like that, but I'm not. I just don't fit any stereotypical kind of pigeonholed view. I understand nationalism and nationalistic feelings amongst people. And I don't think there's anything really wrong with nationalism either. And I sympathise with nationalists, and I'm not talking about, you know, clowns like Tommy Robinson and others, but nationalists who see who have a problem and want to talk openly about what multiculturalism and open borders has done to them and to their neighbourhoods and to their societies and to their country. I have a lot of sympathy with that. I do, genuinely, and you and I've butted heads about this before. When you think nationalism and somebody with nationalist ideas, forget about Donald Trump because he ain't a nationalist, whatever his supporters want to think he is not. What do you think of nationalism as a concept? How would you apply it to today's world and the things we're talking about now?
Well, I'm not really that opposed to nationalism per se, but you do have to ask sort of, well, what is this nation that you're standing up for if you're a nationalist? Here in the United States, we're a nation of immigrants and some very oppressed native people and some slaves who were shipped over here. Yeah. But virtually the entire population, 98% of the population immigrated here one way or another. And so we're from all corners of the world. We don't have a national tradition here in the United States in the sense that people in other parts of the world, as in the British Isles, do. So what is this identity that we're supposed to be hyping, when we start screaming America first or, USA, USA, and wave our flags and so on? It's usually pretty empty-headed. But if you're looking for something to celebrate about the USA, I would look to the ideals of the founding fathers and the Constitution. Sure, a lot of those people were Freemasons, and some of them were probably pretty corrupt, but their ideas, I think, were basically good. That is to have a country that would be as self-governing as possible, that would have, this liberty and justice for all motto. I don't agree with it as the be-all and end-all of life, but I think it's not a bad concept for what they were trying to achieve. Freedom of speech and religion, and having people from different faiths and different cultures living side by side in harmony. Those are all really good ideals. So that's what we really should be celebrating as American nationalists. And that's not what Trump is celebrating. And in fact, since we're all immigrants, we shouldn't be saying immigrants are un-American or anti-American. And as far as Islam goes, Islam has been here forever. There were Muslim explorers here before Columbus, most likely, and maybe a third of the Africans brought here in chains were Muslim. And people like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who to my mind were the central, most important, quintessential American thinkers, were largely Muslim. They were Unitarians. That is the same theology as Islam. And so we have a tremendous Muslim history right here in the United States. The idea that you would keep Muslims out to try to preserve America is wrong-headed at every possible level.
What we've seen here, though, particularly in the northeast of the country and in Yorkshire, we've seen city councils come to be dominated by ethnic Asian folks, often devout Muslims, and with kind of a more conservative view of Islam, and that has caused a lot of problems psychologically for people. And I know you might be tempted to laugh at this, and sometimes I struggle for the terminology. I struggle to find the language to describe this, despite me being a bloody English graduate. But it does something to a people. You know, it certainly affects people spiritually, psychologically. I have no doubt about that. When they see minority cultures come to take precedence, or come to, I'm not going to say take over, but at the expense of the indigenous or minority culture, which would be kind of secular, kind of Christian, kind of tolerant, kind of open. And this is not Muslim bashing now, you know this, because I know why this agenda was, or I believe I know why this agenda came to be and who was behind it. But we're back again to the fact that John and Josephine Smith on the ground level, being affected by it, they don't know who's behind the agenda, and that their, you know, second generation Pakistani neighbour or Sikh neighbour or Indian neighbour or whatever is not behind it. But the fact is they have problems with it. They have a lot of problems with it. You know where I'm going with this, right? At least I hope.
Yeah, I think it's different in the UK.
It's different here, yeah.
Yeah. There's a different culture, different history there. The UK really does have much more tightly knit sort of cultural tribal roots. It's not really a nation of immigrants unless you go all the way back to the Angles, the Saxons, the Celts, and so on, Romans. So that it's not really comparable here in the US. You go to any big city in the U.S. anytime since at least the mid 19th century, maybe early 19th century, you're next to immigrants who speak a different language, have a different religion, act differently, are probably a little ghetto-ish in the sense of the kinds of problems we associate with urban underclasses. That's how the Irish were in West Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. So that's different. In the UK, I do kind of understand how traditional British people would feel badly when their neighborhoods are being taken over by folks from across the seas. That's natural. I don't blame them for feeling that way.
Taken over, in the first hour I was talking about self-censorship with an academic from Dundee, and I don't want to sound like I'm censoring myself. I'm not. Taking over, I don't know if it's a bit harsh, but I remember when I was in London, I think I mentioned this to you before, I met a man in Brent in North London, which is where the People's Voice television was situated. And met a man one day. He wasn't that old, he wasn't that young. And he had some very strong language for how he felt about his area. Now, Brent, massive Asian population. And somebody had told him that David Icke and myself were the conspiracy guys at the TV station down the road. He hadn't seen any of it. And he had no, understanding of the programs we made. But somebody had told him that we were some sort of right-wing type of people, which of course, I shouldn't and wouldn't speak for David Icke. I know he's not right-wing nor left-wing, but speaking for myself, I'm certainly not right-wing. But somebody told him we were, so he came and he spoke to me, and he never said anything that could be construed as hateful, not at all. But he actually said, I'm going to swear now, he said, I fucking hate it. I hate what's happened to my area. I hate it. And if I could get a house or get out of here, I'd get out of here. And I said, why? Why do you hate it? And he said, I'm surrounded by people I don't know who they are. I have nothing in common with them. I don't like what they stand for. And of course, the journalist, what do they stand for? And he said, you have all these women wearing the full dress and all this. Now, whatever about his language, that particular part of London, he was absolutely right. It was kind of wall-to-wall Asian people. And I just thought, I kind of understood him, you know what I mean? I'd never experienced it before in my life. And I thought, how could I ever begin to even start explaining to this gentleman that however bad he feels, and however alienated he feels, and however lonely he feels, that those whom he sees as the invaders are actually not the enemy. How do you even begin to get into that with somebody who sees it, like in Yorkshire where you have councils, that everybody on the council is Asian and Muslim? And you have white people there going, what the fuck is going on here? How do you begin to say to these people, would you believe it if I told you that there's an agenda? This is it, Kevin. This drives me mad. It keeps me up nights,
Yeah, I don't know how to talk to people like that. I could kind of relate to a certain extent in that places from my childhood have changed. I mean, all sorts of things have changed. The values have changed. My childhood was in the early 1960s, just before the big sexual revolution and all the fascinating changes of the 60s and 70s. And so I remember a different world. I remember Madison, Wisconsin, when it was 98% white, and the immigrants were the Italians, and there was a little Italian ghetto. And I remember Pewaukee, Wisconsin, where I went to high school, when it was all fields and woods, and I used to run and jog and bicycle through these beautiful fields. Now it's all torn down. It's all McMansions. It's all ugly. My wife is from Oujda, Morocco, and she feels terrible when we go back to Saidia, Morocco, a nice little Mediterranean beach town. There used to be nothing but Moroccan tourists, and there was a big, beautiful forest. They cut down the whole forest and put up a Club Med, and now it's full of European tourists. It's not the same town anymore. So these kinds of problems are common as the world changes. I guess, but I don't know how desperately, people in the UK have to really worry. I know if you're in a neighborhood that's changed in this kind of way and it's lost for you, it's going to be very painful. But I don't think that the whole UK is going to instantly, or even in any time, become predominantly Asian. Maybe we're moving back to a world where, because people travel so much, there's so many Western people, white people, over in all these other countries. I might even take a university job abroad at some point, and I'll be, intruding on somebody else. So the world has been mixed up by travel and the ease of travel, and I think we're going to have communities and neighborhoods of various ethnicities kind of plop down in an awful lot of places. So there are going to be Asians in London, and there are going to be Hispanics in Madison, Wisconsin. They're probably going to congregate in a particular neighborhood because it just seems to work that way. People do seem to like to be next to people like themselves for the most part. And we might have to get used to the dividing line being neighborhood, not the national border.
Sorry, Kev, for interrupting. Where they look out for one another's interests. You see, the thing is, I clearly see the agenda there. And it's like when we've covered the grooming gangs, the Asian grooming gang stories here. You and I have spoken about it, but I've covered it with people who were involved, ex-police officers and stuff like that. And when you have clowns like Tommy Robinson, you get criticised by presenters like me because Robinson knows nothing. He's just a tool of the establishment to divide people along these lines. And people will say, it's because of guys like you, because you won't report on Muslim grooming gangs. I say, well, we've reported on it and talked about it long before the likes of Tommy Robinson ever did. But the fact is, an Asian man is no more likely to be an abuser of young children than a black man or a white man. And, we have a huge child trafficking problem in this country, as there is in the United States, not just with links to the establishment. It's controlled by the establishment. We know that paedophile rings are operating where children are being taken on planes around the world. We know this for a fact. It isn't speculation. And those are financial elites, those are political elites, and those people are white people. So I just throw that out the window, this idea that, Asians are more likely to do this or do that. It's just a complete and utter nonsense. But yet the agenda is there to force a culture clash in countries through forced migration, because ultimately we haven't reached a level of consciousness yet where we're able to understand that Dr. Raj, who lives across the road, is originally from India. Or Afsil, who lives across the street, who's second generation Pakistani. And Paddy here, Richie, living across the road again. We all have the same enemy. And we're nowhere near that level of consciousness of understanding that. We're still reduced to this. And you have to try and understand it. This, we're being invaded. Because on one level, they are being invaded. But it's not the fault of, if we can kind of phrase, the invadees. But we're nowhere near reaching that level of understanding, Kevin. And I don't know. Yeah. I'm going to give up, mate. I'm not joking. I can see myself this time next year taking a job somewhere and jacking it in, just forgetting about it. Because I think it's like the Matrix. It's like the architect of the Matrix saying to Keanu Reeves, Neo, Listen, we've had 1,000 guys like you before try to explain this to people, right? It's never going to work. They're never going to listen because it's too easy to be, I'm a Trump fan, I'm a Hillary fan, I love Jeremy Corbyn, or I love whoever. It's just so much easier to do that than to think, well, hang on a second, what's really going on? So, Kev, help me, take me out of this abyss of depression. What are we going to do?
Well, I hope you hang on and you don't just go for the moolah and take some kind of commercial job, because we need you on the radio.
No.
There are really a handful of super, really, really good radio people out there. And, you and Bonnie Faulkner, too, I could quickly name as just doing superb work. And so I would urge you to be patient and recognize that things change, that there's, like right now, this, super tribalism, anti-immigration and Islamophobia and that stuff. It's really the flavor of the month. And it wasn't very long ago that libertarianism was the flavor of the month. The Donald Trump of 2005, 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012 was Ron Paul here in the United States. And all of the young people who were sort of conservative, who were trying to get all excited about some new political philosophy, they were totally into libertarianism. And there's still some of that out there. And some of these people, these libertarians, have actually morphed into sort of Trump supporters, which is bizarre to me because Trump is the opposite of a libertarian. But in any case, these things change, these intellectual fads and these political zeitgeists, and they wear out. And I think this one's I hope it wears out, hopefully, because they put a lid on it. I mean, I certainly hope that the floodgates of immigration don't get wider and wider and wider and drive people crazier and crazier and crazier. I don't think they will, because there is this political reaction. So it'll probably slow down and things will calm down and it'll go off somewhere else. And we need people like you to be leading the conversation as it goes off somewhere else, to be helping people see what's really going on so the conversation can actually get at the real problems.
Yeah, because I mean, it's the policies of globalization and the policies of, political unions like the European Union and other unions are causing widespread poverty and degradation for everybody, regardless of what you look like or which God you pray to when you get on your knees before you go to bed. It's killing people. I mean, it's starving people to death in this country. And it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are in this country, you're not unaffected by having to go to food banks because of austerity imposed on you, because of a debt that you didn't incur, to pay back financial elites. At some stage, people are going to have to realise that. Yes, okay, it's not nice to be in a community where you've suddenly become the minority. We understand that. It's wrong, and there is an agenda behind that. And it's not nice that, sometimes terrorist events happen, a lot of them false flags, like you said, Kevin, some of them genuine. But Christ, just get beyond the black and white story on Sky News and try and have a look at who benefits. That great Latin phrase, cui bono, who benefited from that? Because nobody does. Well, in terms of your neighbours and your community, nobody benefits from it. The guy across the road who's got a wife who wears the burqa and he's very conservative and he doesn't have any time for you and you don't have any time for him, he doesn't benefit from it either. That's that level of consciousness that I think people are going to have to reach. And it's not virtue signalling and it's not being a socialist. It's just see beyond the ridiculous black and white identity politics, conservative versus socialist. It's just bollocks. It's garbage. People are fleeing from the Middle East, and some of them might be bad people, but they're fleeing from a totalitarian, oppressive imperialism that's blown their houses to pieces, killed their children. What the fuck else are they going to do? Only leave that country. And you have Trump saying we're going to close the borders, even though the people behind Trump, the neocon Zionist lunatics, are the very people responsible for the carnage in Syria. And it's not even that difficult to understand, Kevin. So it isn't. It's basic understanding if you just have a little scratch beneath the surface.
Absolutely. Well, here in the U.S., the Muslim immigrants actually tend to skew towards being highly educated, and many engineers and doctors and people like that. The doctors, or Muslim doctors, are out here in the rural areas serving the underserved communities. It's really not a problem with Muslim immigration in the United States. I can see why people in the UK might have a problem with immigration from the Indian subcontinent. But in any case, the real enemies, as you suggest, are the people who are behind these destructive policies. And I think maybe we should simplify our message a little bit. I think that, I've been trying to sell all of these truthful messages about how terrible things are and how they could be improved. I think it's too complicated maybe for people with limited time on their hands. So maybe we should distill this down to talk about debt slavery and the fact that about 1/3 of every dollar or pound or euro that you spend, that you take in, is stolen from you by debt, what Muslims call riba, usury. That is, these are rents. It's rent on money. And if you add it all up, it does come out to be about 1/3 of the economy is stolen from the people's productivity who are actually doing the work and producing the goods, and it's taken by the usurers. We need to totally reform that system, and that's the system that is screwing over the ordinary people, and it could easily be reformed. We know how to do it. Public currency is pretty straightforward. Read Ellen Brown's books for the details. Maybe that's the issue that could wake people up.
It's interesting you say that, Kevin. I mentioned in the first hour a party that I was at last Saturday. It was lovely. I met some people there. Most of them are younger than me, and they all work for a very well-known company, a very well-known corporation. And the subject about buying houses came up, and I couldn't resist it, Kev. I try to keep my mouth shut when I'm out, you know what I mean? Because I don't like to be forcing my opinions on people, and I try to keep a very low profile anyway. But I had to say it. I said, the banks commit fraud when they give you money to buy a mortgage, to buy a house, because they haven't given you any money. And the first thing they do is they take an insurance policy out against you in terms of if you default on the mortgage, which is a fraudulent practice anyway. And then the bank goes out of its way to make it difficult for you to pay the mortgage so that they can take possession of the house. And they never lost anything anyway because they never really issued you any money. But also they then go and claim against the insurance company. This is grand larceny. It's crime, unimaginable crime. You know what was amazing? I didn't say it quite like that. I wasn't very dogmatic actually. And all the girls, it was all girls. You know what? All of them, they all went, yeah, we know. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know whether to be surprised or kind of heartbroken or fed up or depressed because they knew. And they were like, yeah, we understand. And I thought, Christ, we should be out in the streets with pitchforks and burning torches. They understand that when they go to the Halifax or when they go to Lloyd's Bank to get a mortgage, that a crime is committed the minute they sign on the paper. And it's not being committed by them. It's being committed by the financial elites, which doesn't give them any money and then which collects their house when they default and everything else. But they knew, Kev. I was amazed. I couldn't believe it, I was like, Christ, my work is done here, basically. But I thought, but what are you going to do with that information now? I didn't say that, but, you've got to do something with that. You can't just live with that information. So maybe there is hope. Maybe I don't need to be depressed. I'm going to give you the final word. Do say hello, by the way, to your lovely wife, Rabia, and let her know that I left Facebook about a month ago. And she would occasionally type some comments on Facebook because she might listen to maybe an occasional program, and I would thank her and type back to her. I've left Facebook. People don't know that, but I've disappeared off Facebook completely. But do say hello to her, Kevin, and I'm going to give you the last word, my friend. Go ahead.
Okay, well, my dear wife Rabia loves your show. She listens to a lot more of your shows than of my shows.
Good stuff.
But I'm not jealous. Anyway, so I'll pass the word on to her. And well, I don't know. I guess, I think we do have to just keep on going. It's a long struggle and we're not guaranteed of success, but I think it's its own reward in a way. Knowing that you did the right thing makes it easier to sleep at night and live with yourself. And we certainly have a broad field open for us here in terms of telling the truth about really important stuff that the mainstream's lying about. I mean, that's a niche that really needs to be filled. And it's better to have it filled by people who are doing it right than people who aren't. And so I really hope you're going to stick around and keep broadcasting, Richie. Going off Facebook is one thing. I don't blame you. Getting as far away from Zuckerberg as possible sounds like a good idea. Yeah. I wish I could do it too, but I got to promote my shows, and I'm still stuck with the Zuck. But I think we need you to keep forging ahead for another 10, 20 years at least or more. because I think things are going to change. The pendulum's going to swing back, maybe in a good direction, but it's going to be different, is all we know. 10 years from now, we'll have another conversation. Hopefully, we'll have others before that, and we'll be able to look back and say, we sure didn't see this coming.
I'll catch up with you again. I hope you're right, by the way, in the fall, as you say over there, you crazy Yanks. It's the autumn, of course. Folks, in the meantime, check out Kevin's work at truthjihad.com if you haven't before. There aren't too many people like him. It's not the Mutual Appreciation Society either. There aren't many people like Kevin Barrett today writing and broadcasting like he does. Thanks, mate. Look after yourself. Enjoy the summer. Again, regards to Rabia, and I'll catch up with you in the early fall for another chat. Always love it, Kev. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Richie. Keep up the great work.
Cheers, mate. Bye for now. Kevin Barrett, live on the line from Madison, Wisconsin there, and you heard him on Wednesday's Richie Allen Show. That is it.